Welcome to Murdock's Music Minute, the very tiny channel that talks about music, album reviews, ranking of discographies, and all those things that you can find on a dozen other more professional channels here on YouTube. I talk about music that I like and sometimes about music that I don't like that much, but still find interesting enough to talk about. Today's album reviews contains them all. Edgar Allan Poe, The Beatles, Pink Floyd, when actually we're talking about
the Alan Parsons Project.
Oh my God.
Welcome to a classic album review on Murdock's Music Minute. Well, Alan Parsons is not a professor from Cambridge, but a sound engineer originally and a producer. And the idea, the concept for the Alan Parsons project indeed was that it should be a project with interchangeable lineup, interchangeable musicians, more like a film director casts different actors for each individual movie. So the album is a project, a production, and each album maybe needs different personnel. More about that and how the project came into being in a little clip show before me and Nevermore will review the Alan Parsons Project debut album. To get to the core of the Alan Parsons Project, one needs to talk about two persons, Alan Parsons and Eric Woolfson. Parsons had made a name for himself as a sound engineer. He had started in the tape duplication department at EMI, but soon tried to land a job with the prestigious Abbey Road Studios, then of course most associated with the recordings of the Beatles. Aged only 18, Parsons was employed as an assistant engineer there in late 1967. He was tape operator during the Beatles' Get Back sessions and was credited as engineer on Abbey Road. After that, he became a much-sought sound engineer working on famous albums such as Wings' Red Rose Speedway, Romany by the Hollies, and, most famously, Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. The clear soundscapes and experimentation with audio effects gained him a Grammy Award nomination. From the mid-70s onwards, Parsons changed to the role of producer, thus also bringing his keen ear for sound and mixing to those projects, most notably Year of the Cat by Al Stewart and the debut album of the band, Pilot. But Parsons had started contemplating to do music of his own. An encounter with Eric Woolfson at the Abbey Road Cantina turned out to be far-reaching. Woolfson was a Scottish songwriter, producer and occasional singer who had taught himself to play the piano as a kid. He had started in the 60s as a session pianist in London and had been hired as a songwriter for acts like Marianne Faithfull, The Tremolos and Marmalade. For a while he tried his hands at record producing, but soon found the management side of things could be more to his taste. However, when in 1974 he was approached by Alan Parsons at Abbey Road Studios to become his manager, the idea was born to do a joint project together. Woolfson, who was a huge fan of Poe's works, eventually came up with the idea for a conceptual album, and thus it was the birth of
the Alan Parsons Project.
And this was the very first product of the project. Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which also was the title of a collection of Poe short stories, mainly his more creepy ones. I bought this album second-hand, as you can see probably from the conditions of the sleeve, for a very reasonable price. Whoops, nevermore, don't leave me this way. For a very reasonable price in a little record shop in Edinburgh, Scotland. I've been to Scotland last year in summer again. The shop wasn't there anymore. I guess that's the fate of all the small second-hand record shops. They pop up and then they disappear, or maybe they had just moved to a different address. Very nice, not only gatefold, but there is actually a little booklet inside. And here you can see the sort of mascot, or the symbolic character Alan Parsons and Eric Wolfson created for this album, the Abominable Tape Man. It looks like a mummy, but if you watch more closely, you will see, maybe not on the video, but if you find the album somewhere, that it's a mummy wrapped in tape. So sharp-tongued critics on seeing this probably said, yes, this simply is an abominable monster created in the laboratory or in the studio by a guy called Alan Parsons. Very nice liner notes in the booklet as well. A chronology about important dates, stages in the life of Edgar Allan Poe. Photographies and very nice, drawings, graphics. You have this mummy tape man everywhere, and the lyrics to the songs. And we will get to the lyrics a little bit later when I go track by track through the album. And here in the end also photographs of the main persons in the project. This is a young Mr. Alan Parsons, Eric Wolfson, that's him here, and I keep saying Andy Powell, but it's Andrew Powell. Andy Powell is a member of Wishbone Ash. Andrew Powell is a conductor and orchestral arranger who worked on at least the first couple of Alan Parsons Project albums. And I'm sure I will mention that later again. He is a main ingredient, one of the secret weapons or secret ingredients to the great formula on those early classic Alan Parsons albums. The record itself looks like this. Released on 20th Century Records. This is, and how did this get to Edinburgh, I wonder? Okay, this is a German pressing, and it looks like it could be a German pressing from 1976, so a first German pressing, released on 20th Century Records. So, experts on the Alan Parsons Project will now immediately know which version of the album I'm going to review, because in the 80s, I think a good 10 years after its original release, either in 1986 or 1987, Alan Parsons remastered this whole album and re-released a 1980s version of Tales of Mystery and Imagination. As far as I know, I think I only listened to the 80s version once or twice. He really used the original master tapes and just had them cleaned up and remastered and remixed, but maybe he also did some re-recordings, or at least he added some things that are not on the original release. The two most evident differences from the original version and the 80s remastered version are one, there's a narration by none other than Orson Welles on the version from the 80s. He recorded this already in the 70s, but handed in his narration a little bit too late when the deadline had already been reached, or the record already had gone into pressing. So grudgingly, Alan Parsons and Eric Wolfson had to agree for the original release that it would be released without the narration, which had been already had already been planned to be a part of the album in 1976. And you also have a longer version with an added, really great guitar solo of The Raven on the 1987 remaster. Still, I was keen to get the original pressing because the 1980s remastered version also has what every 1980s album has got: very 80s sounding, reverb heavy and gated drums. And while I'm not totally against 1980s gated drums, especially not on albums that actually were recorded and produced in the 1980s, to me that drum sound really ruins the listening experience, especially if you are used to the warmer, more organic 1970s drum sound on the original release. So despite little bonuses that actually enhance the listening experience, Orson Welles, more guitar, I prefer the original 1976 version, and that's the one I will be talking about. Like so many of the more experimental or progressive albums from the 1970s, the cover artwork and design came from the famous graphics and design company Hypnosis. And this is how it looks like if you open up the gatefold entirely. In the credits, Parsons thanks or acknowledges 200 musicians who worked or played on this album, and I guess this high number is due to an entire orchestra that will receive its own moment of highlight or moment in the limelight on side 2. Other than that, we have different vocalists. As I've already said, that was a trademark of the Alan Parsons project. Not only that they used a different singer for each album, but they changed singers with each track on the albums. I mean, throughout the history, you get various vocalists who continuously work with the Alan Parsons project, but usually you have a different singer from one track to the next, and that approach was already established with this very first album. Some of the vocalists that we will hear on Tales of Mystery and Imagination are actually quite well known, or at least became well known afterwards. But we begin this album with another, or maybe the trademark of Alan Parsons, namely an instrumental. So the album side 1 opens with A Dream Within a Dream. That's also the title of a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. But this track, as mentioned, is an instrumental, or, well, it features vocals, but no lyrics. The backing band here is practically the entire band Pilot that Alan Parsons simply hijacked to become his backing band for the Alan Parsons project. Pilot had a couple of minor hit singles, I believe, in the 1970s, and were somewhere between progressive rock and soft rock. And yeah, the musicians from Pilot are featured on all of the classic Alan Parsons Project albums, and they open this album here with a theme, a melody that actually mimics the famous strike, the clocks of the Big Ben in London. It's very ambient, very dreamy, so we don't get a dark or menacing sound here. The music fades in very slowly, fits the title, I think, A Dream Within a Dream. Then keyboards and synthesizers come in, the great forte or the love of Alan Parsons. And finally, the band kicks in with a steady bass, a thumping bass, and a steady drum beat. The melody of the track has something ethereal, something floating about it, but is grounded, as mentioned, by a very straightforward, steady drum beat. The music builds up to a tender crescendo and then fades away again to immediately change into the next track, the first proper song, with which Parsons and Wolfson decided already at the beginning of this album to tackle one of the true biggies, Edgar Allan Poe's most famous and revered poem, The Raven.
The clock struck midnight, and through my sleeping, I heard it tapping at
The Raven, and for this one, Nevermore is back. Opens with only one note on the bass guitar, and then Alan Parsons can be heard in one of his rare vocal performances, but filtered through a vocoder. And The Raven not only allegedly was the first song the Alan Parsons Project ever recorded under this name, it's also the first song to ever feature the sound of a vocoder. And in the liner notes, it is stated, not without pride, that the harmony vocoder on The Raven was invented and built by EMI Central Research Laboratories and is exclusively available at Abbey Road Studios. Yeah, this comes from a time also when sound engineers still worked and ran around in the studios in white laboratory coats. It must have sounded extremely alien and outlandish for listeners in the 70s. The vocoder very soon became quite popular in both progressive rock music, but also disco music, etc. Here it opens The Raven. If you know the poem, Parsons and Wolfson don't even try in the faintest to recreate the poem or the almost hypnotic rhythm and flow of Poe's language. The song consists of several lines from the poem, but are in no way a true recital or recreation of Poe's poem. Later on, after the first verse, a singer comes in, Leonard Whiting, who was actually more an actor than a singer. He might be known as a very young chap, a very young Romeo, from the 1968 film version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a film I have to admit that I have not seen yet, but I think it has a bit of a scandalous image because it employed a very young Romeo and Juliet couple, though probably that comes close to what the intention of the original play by Shakespeare also was. I believe Romeo and Juliet are meant to be true teenage lovers at the age between 14 and 16 years of age. Anyways, I'm digressing. We are talking about the Raven. So Leonard Whiting is the singer here. And maybe it has something to do with him being an actor. He brings a certain stage production approach to his singing. It almost sounds like it could have been from a stage show, from a musical. There's a certain drama to the whole procedure, and it's probably not surprising that especially Eric Wolfson later on abandoned the idea of the Alan Parsons Project and pop music in order to write a few stage shows and musicals. And I think the seeds for this are already sown here on this very first album. Despite this maybe musical element, The Raven, while not exactly dark, has a bit of menace to it and becomes increasingly more rocking, with electric guitar coming in and the band getting louder. It's really a good track. I like it very much. There's a certain power and urgency to it. The original poem, is about being haunted not only by a raven, but rather this symbolizes the haunting memories, or, well, almost being in the grips of the memories of a lost love or a deceased, a dead person. Very much the Gothic romantic style that Edgar Allan Poe is best known for. After this certain grandeur of the vocal performance on The Raven, we get to something completely different. The adaptation of one of my favorite Edgar Allan Poe short stories, The Telltale Heart. A story about a murder and the feeling of guilt, maybe, and the psychological consequences this murder has on the actual culprit, who's probably a psychopath, actually. And the vocalist they got for this story or song probably is the best vocalist they could have chosen for The Telltale Heart. Arthur Brown, best known for his manic hit Fire, which came out in 68 or 69. So this was a good 10 years later. Arthur Brown is not only known for his very special stage appearance, he's often considered the father of shock rock, even before Alice Cooper. He also brings in a lot of character into his singing style, and from listening to this, one really gets the impression that Arthur Brown absolutely enjoyed slipping into the role of this psychopath killer. He screams and spits out the words and sounds more and more desperate and horrified throughout this song, which, by the way, is the most hard-rocking song I've ever heard from the Alan Parsons Project, built around very cool, nice little guitar lick. It's more up-tempo and, features the band Pilot doing the best they can to provide a, more hard rock sound. This is truly a highlight on this album, maybe also comes closest to what listeners would have expected from an album dealing with the dark horror stories by Edgar Allan Poe. On the whole, this album musically is more prog pop and not so much, gothic rock or heavy metal, genres that at least listeners nowadays would probably expect from an album on Edgar Allan Poe's stories. However, The Telltale Heart has quite an edge to it. It also features choir vocals that come in for a bit of a dissonant break in between. Overall, I would say mission accomplished with this track, even though, again, of course, lyrics to a 3-minute rock song can never reach or condense the psychological depth and the tension and atmosphere that you get from reading the original and the whole short story by Edgar Allan Poe.
Heard all the things in heaven and earth. I've seen many things in hell, but it's Vulture's eye of a cold pale blue. It's the eye of the devil himself.
The fourth track is a musical adaptation of the Cask of Amontillado, or I think Amontillado would be a more correct pronunciation. Anyways, also one of my favorite short stories by Poe. This one belongs to his series of revenge fantasies. There are a couple of stories by Edgar Allan Poe that deal with quite cruel revenge. The Cask of Amontillado is more a kind of pre-planned, cold-blooded revenge story, quite with a sarcastic undertone in the story. The song here is rather mild in tone. It has, again, a very lush orchestral accompaniment and probably would rank as a kind of pop rock ballad, but with a break in the middle, or actually recurring breaks that add a bit more tension to the whole song. Maybe again not what you would expect at first from a song that deals with this revenge story. Over time, I have to say, it has become probably my favorite song from the entire album. The vocalist here is John Miles, who soon was to have a UK hit single with the song Music, also produced by Alan Parsons and also released in 1976. This song also features a chord progression, a progression of 3 chords already at the intro of the song, that should become a kind, at least to me, a kind of trademark chord progression that you find in several Alan Parsons project tunes. He or Wolfson, or both of them, had a kind of predilection for this kind of chord progressions. You also hear it later on in The Fall of the House of Usher, but also in songs on other Alan Parsons projects. The dialogue between the story's main character and his victim, who is walled in alive, in this song is depicted by 2 different vocalists with interchanging lines, but in maybe the most pop, the most tender moments on this album, almost a bit like Electric Light Orchestra or Holly's pop song. But somehow, if you've listened to the song several times, this is actually quite effective. This very beautiful, tender music that actually describes very gruesome events. Yeah, the Cask of Amontillado, excellent pop rock song.
Bring back some light in the name. You feel your mind slipping away.
Side 1 closes with the system of Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether, which is a story by Poe that shows his love for occasional satire or irony and sarcasm. The original short story can be read, for example, as a satire on psychiatry or maybe even on society in general. It plays with the idea of the lunatics taking over an asylum without anybody noticing at first. If you don't know the story, you won't get too much from that out of the lyrics of this song. The lyrics rather seem to talk about maybe debauchery or simply living life to the full, enjoying the sweet things in life rather recklessly. This is a bouncy pop rock song, very catchy, has a very nice groove to it, and was also chosen as, or was released as a single from this album, and even, well, at least made it to number 37 in the US Billboard charts. The album version of the song then, at the end, in the coda, returns actually to themes, musical themes and motifs from the beginning of side 1, A Dream Within a Dream, and The Raven, a method employed by the Alan Parsons Project several times also on later albums, that of course gives the listener the impression that this is more than simply a bunch of proggy pop rock songs, but rather maybe a cycle of songs that are somehow connected and form a whole concept. And indeed, at least this debut album by the Alan Parsons Project can certainly be considered a concept album. It's a very simple, but in that way also ingenious concept. We take stories by an author and make our musical rock versions of those stories. And to this day, there is debate among fans and critics whether the following Alan Parsons Project albums, or at least some of them, also can be considered true concept albums. But at least in my opinion, Tales of Mystery and Imagination definitely counts among the numerous concept albums of the 1970s.
You're in need of Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether.
And after this basically flawless side A, we can turn the record over and start with side 2, which only contains 2 tracks. And this side 2 is where things get really progressive in the true sense of the word, at least in the sense of the genre of progressive rock. Side 2 opens with The Fall of the House of Usher, which is also the longest track, I believe, the Alan Parsons Project ever put onto a record, if you discount the suite on side 2 of Turn of a Friendly Card. The Fall of the House of Usher is a 15-minute track. It consists of 4 sections, and we start with a prelude, which is purely orchestral. It's a very haunting, eerie orchestral score. As a child, when I heard this for the first time, I was really a bit freaked out by some passages that are completely cacophony. And at the same time, I was more than impressed to find 5 minutes of classical orchestral music on a supposedly rock album. I'm still blown away, but it turns out Alan Parsons and Eric Wolfson did not sit down to write an orchestral score. Neither did Andrew Powell, who did all the orchestral arrangements and the conducting on this album. Actually, the prelude to The Fall of the House of Usher is a segment from the unfinished opera The Fall of the House of Usher by Claude Debussy, composed at the beginning of the 20th century, but apparently never finished, so it's just a fragment. And the Alan Parsons project simply took this music and put it as the prelude to their instrumental rework of The Fall of the House of Usher. It's not credited on the record, which is a bit shady, to be honest. So what we get here is 5 minutes of Claude Debussy. I think it's an impressive work of classical music. Maybe even especially in the context of this album, which is more progressive pop rock or prog light, as some people might say. It really sets up a cinematic, dark and haunting atmosphere. Fantastic. Then we get to section number 2, which is called Arrival, probably referring to the arrival of the narrator in the story, The Fall of the House of Usher. We hear again very impressive sounds, field recordings of a thunderstorm, rain, thunder. Then an organ sets in. It's a bit cliche for maybe a 1960s or 1970s B-horror movie. You really expect Christopher Lee to lurk behind the corner. Organ, thunderstorms, and then again a very haunting synthesizer motif until the whole band sets in again with a very steady, plodding beat. Bit of a Pink Floyd atmosphere in this section, at least in my opinion. Also one of my favorites moments on this album. Then we get to the third section, which is, I have to look it up. It's called Intermezzo. It's a brief, very dissonant orchestral crescendo that then segues into Pavane. It's the fourth section, and I just saw it's actually 5 sections, not 4 sections. So the 4th section is called Pavane, and that is a very tuneful, melodic, almost pastoral, laid-back instrumental section played by various stringed instruments. It sounds a bit like a lute or maybe even a zither. Why this is part of their interpretation of The Fall of the House of Usher is a bit unclear to me, because as I've said, this is a very relaxed, breezy, acoustic instrumental piece. A pavane is a processional dance from either Italy or Spain, from Renaissance times. Maybe, and the only interpretation that I have got, maybe this alludes to the fact that Roderick Usher in the story has a very heightened nervous sense of hearing, and also tells the narrator in the story that the only music that he can actually tolerate in this state of heightened senses are certain stringed instruments. So maybe this is a reference to this little detail from the story here. And then the whole thing crashes down in, again, cacophony by the orchestra, which symbolizes the fall of the house of Usher. In the story, of course, spoiler alert, this means that Roderick Usher's sister had been buried alive by her own brother, but she can break free from her crypt, walks through the house, and finally breaks into the room of where Roderick Usher and the narrator are sitting, and with her last strength she strangles and kills her own brother, thus exterminating the last remaining line of the family of Usher, and also the house collapses at the end of the story. So that was the fall of the house of Usher. I've read a few reviews, also watched a few comments on YouTube and on other sources, where listeners actually claim that they actively dislike side 2, and there seems to be sometimes a sense of that this is more or less a lack of ideas, or a wasted side of vinyl with this huge epic but ultimately a bit pointless or boring instrumental. I beg to differ. I think this is a fantastic piece of, yes, pompous and maybe a bit self-indulgent progressive rock music, or rather cinematic symphonic rock music. But on an album like this that deals with short stories from the 19th century and stories with a very gothic nature, I think this is a very, very fine and enjoyable piece of instrumental music. Then we get to the last track of the entire album, 2-1 in Paradise, which opens with actually the same discordant, dissonant strings that really are unpleasant to listen to, but this crescendo then fades away and turns into a lush, very tender pop ballad, which always sounded to me a little bit like Pink Floyd had been told to write a pop song, maybe in the style of the Electric Light Orchestra, around the time of maybe Metal or Obscured by Clouds. That's the feeling I get from this final track. It's a very dreamy, lush pop ballad, maybe even almost a little bit cheesy, kitschy, but I like it, I enjoy it. It's a fine, more tuneful, more positive sounding closing track to this album, to Leaving the Universe of Edgar Allan Poe. 2-1 in Paradise is, I think, an early poem by Poe. It's not that well known, certainly not as well known as his short stories. And that's the debut album by the Alan Parsons Project. Well, reviews to this album were a bit mixed at the time of release, and they remain mixed to this day. with, well, some saying that this was just the beginning of the Alan Parsons project, and the better works followed, while others see this as a cult album these days. It was quite successful in the USA, at least for a debut album. It made number 38 in the charts there, and almost cracked the top 10 in Germany. In the UK, it missed the top 50, so this was a successful start, but not, a huge mega seller when it came out. Personally, and I guess you already gained that impression from my review, I'm a huge fan of this album. I think this is simply brilliant. One of the best Alan Parsons project albums out there. It is progressive in places, especially on side 2. You get more of the ambitious experimental side of Alan Parsons, but side 1 basically is very accessible pop rock, sometimes with a bit of a mysterious element to it, but overall very accessible 1970s pop rock. So if you are a fan, of 70s pop, of 70s rock, give this a try. If you are a fan of progressive music, this could also be quite interesting for you, even though it never really steers into the super complex and completely bombastic and weird territories that, for instance, Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer did at times. If you're a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, maybe this album is also an interesting, at least curiosity, to listen to at least once. And with that, I'll finish my first review, in this case of the Edgar Allan Parsons project. The band, the project, went on to become huge stars in the late 70s and especially in the early 80s, to then sort of implode in the mid 80s. They are not talked that much about these days, but I'm sure even if you're not really aware of the Alan Parsons project, you will know a few of their songs when you hear them, maybe on the radio or in television shows. Excellent album. Seek it out and stay tuned for more Murdock Music Minutes. Thus quoth the raven, 10 out of 10.
And all my days are trances, and all my nightly dreams are where thy dark eye glances.